Every dynasty has a moment when silence becomes louder than any war. For Ceadric Ashcombe, Duke of Blackthorn, that moment arrived the night his own council voted to strip his authority, and he walked into their chamber alone, unarmed, and smiled. What followed rewrote the rules of English aristocracy and turned an abandoned estate into the most dangerous piece of land in the kingdom. But the real threat was never the conspiracy waiting in the shadows. It was the woman who refused to kneel when every man before her had broken. If you stay until the very end of this story, you will understand why power without opposition is nothing but slow decay. The storm had been building over the North Sea for 3 days before it finally struck the cliffs of Blackthorn with a violence that bent ancient oaks sideways and stripped tiles from the rooftops of tenant cottages scattered along the coastal road. Rain hammered the fortress walls in horizontal sheets, and the sea below churned against the rock face with enough force to send tremors through the stone foundations that had stood for 4 centuries. Ceadric Ashcombe stood at the narrow window of his private study on the eastern tower, watching the storm consume the coastline below. He did not flinch when lightning split the sky close enough to illuminate the veins in his hands where they rested against the cold sill. He had stopped flinching at anything years ago. Flinching required the expectation that something worse might follow, and Ceadric had already survived the worst thing a man of his position could endure: betrayal from the people who shared his blood. His study was sparse by aristocratic standards. No gilded frames, no velvet drapes softening the medieval stone. A single desk of dark walnut occupied the center, its surface organized with the obsessive precision of a man who trusted nothing he could not see and reach. Maps of Blackthorn's territories covered the wall behind him, every boundary line redrawn in his own hand after the land disputes of the previous decade. The bookshelves held legal volumes, military treatises, and correspondence files arranged by date. Not a single portrait hung anywhere in the room. Ceadric had ordered every family painting removed from the fortress 3 years ago, the morning after his younger brother Marcus tried to have him declared unfit before the House of Lords. That particular wound had healed on the surface. Underneath it festered in the way only fraternal betrayal can, quietly, persistently, rewriting every assumption about loyalty that a man builds in childhood. A knock at the door. 3 precise raps. Ceadric recognized the rhythm before the voice followed. "Your Grace, Lord Pemberton has arrived from London. He insists on an audience tonight." Ceadric did not turn from the window. "Insists. His word, Your Grace, not mine." "Show him to the West Gallery. Let him wait exactly 30 minutes. Serve nothing." "Very good, Your Grace." The footsteps retreated down the corridor. Ceadric remained at the window for another full minute, watching the waves claw at the base of the cliffs. Pemberton was the crown's unofficial envoy to the northern duchies, a man who carried messages that the king preferred not to commit to paper. His arrival during a storm meant the message could not wait for better weather, which meant someone in London was afraid. Fear in London usually meant opportunity in Blackthorn, but Ceadric had learned to distrust opportunity that arrived uninvited. He crossed the study and pulled on a dark coat, ignoring the mirror beside the door. He knew what he looked like. 34 years old, sharp-featured, built with the lean hardness of a man who still trained with his soldiers every morning despite his rank. Dark hair cut shorter than fashion dictated, a jaw that clenched too often, and eyes that gave away nothing. The aristocratic world called him handsome in the same breath they called him terrifying, and Ceadric had never cared enough about the first adjective to soften the second. The West Gallery was a long corridor of arched windows facing the interior courtyard. During daylight, it offered a view of the training grounds where Blackthorn's personal guard drilled. At night, it offered nothing but darkness and the echo of footsteps on flagstone. Lord Pemberton stood near the far end, visibly uncomfortable. He was a round man in his 50s, dressed in London fashion that looked absurd against the medieval severity of Blackthorn Castle. His traveling cloak was still wet, and he held it bunched in his hands like a nervous habit he could not control. Ceadric entered from the opposite end and walked the full length of the gallery without hurrying. 47 steps. He counted them the way he counted everything. Information was currency, and even the dimensions of his own home were worth cataloging. "Pemberton." "Your Grace." The envoy managed a bow that was slightly too shallow. "I apologize for the hour. The matter is urgent." "Urgent matters are the only kind worth discussing. Sit." There were no chairs in the gallery. Kedrick had ordered them removed years ago. Meetings in this corridor happened standing, which meant they happened quickly. Pemberton swallowed and adjusted his grip on the wet cloak. It concerns the Thornfield estate, south of your border, the property that has been in Crown receivership for the past 11 years. I know what Thornfield is. Yes. Well, Pemberton cleared his throat. The courts have located an heir. Kedrick's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a recalculation so fast and so complete that by the time Pemberton finished his next sentence, the Duke had already mapped 3 possible scenarios and discarded 2 of them. An heir, Kedrick repeated. A woman, Lady Seraphine Vale, daughter of the late Baron Aldrich Vale, who held Thornfield before the Crown seized it during the investigations. She has been living in reduced circumstances in Kent. The courts have verified her claim. She arrives within the fortnight to take possession. The silence that followed was the kind that made Pemberton's hands tremble slightly against the wet fabric of his cloak. It was not an angry silence. It was the silence of a mind working at a speed that left no room for emotional reaction. Who authorized the release? The Lord Chancellor's office. The order was signed 3 days ago. Without consulting me. Your Grace, the property is technically outside your jurisdiction. The border is a legal fiction drawn by clerks who have never set foot north of Hertfordshire. Kedrick's voice dropped but did not sharpen. The quieter he spoke, the more dangerous the words became. Everyone who had dealt with him knew this. Thornfield sits on the only overland route between my eastern territories and the port at Ashford. Whoever controls that estate controls my supply lines. The Crown has held it in receivership because I made it extremely clear that any alternative would be treated as a strategic provocation. Pemberton's face had gone the color of old parchment. The Chancellor is aware of your position, Your Grace. He asked me to convey that the decision was made in accordance with inheritance law and carries no political intent. The Chancellor is a liar, but that is not new information. Kedrick turned and walked 3 steps toward the window before stopping. The rain outside had intensified, turning the courtyard into a shallow lake that reflected the torchlight from the battlements above. Tell me about the woman. Lady Seraphine Vale, 26 years old, educated privately. Her father lost everything during the Thornfield investigation, and she was raised by a maternal aunt in Canterbury after his death. She has no political connections, no allies of significance, and no experience managing an estate. The general assessment is that she will find the property uninhabitable and petition to sell within 6 months. The general assessment. Yes, Your Grace. And what is your assessment, Pemberton? The envoy hesitated. This was the kind of question that could end a career if answered incorrectly. I believe she is being used as a pawn. Someone wants Thornfield out of receivership, and she is the legal mechanism to accomplish it. Kedrick glanced at him. For the first time, something close to respect flickered across his features. Pemberton was a coward in person, but his political instincts were occasionally sharp enough to be useful. Who? I do not know, but the timing is suspicious. Your brother Marcus has been seen in London more frequently in recent weeks, and the Duke of Ashford has been quietly acquiring properties along the southern corridor. Marcus. The name landed in Kedrick's chest like a blade finding an old scar. His brother had been exiled from Blackthorn after the competency hearing failed, stripped of his household allowance, and cut from every family record Kedrick had authority to alter. But exile did not mean erasure. Marcus still carried the Ashcombe name, still held minor titles that gave him access to London's political machinery, and still nursed the kind of hatred that only grows in men who believe they were denied something they deserved. When does she arrive at Thornfield? The 15th, possibly sooner depending on road conditions. Then we have 12 days. 12 days for what, Your Grace? Kedrick looked at Pemberton with an expression that made the older man take half a step backward. To determine whether Lady Seraphine Vale is a person or a weapon, and to act accordingly. He turned and left the gallery without another word. Behind him, Pemberton stood in the darkness for several minutes, trying to decide whether the shaking in his hands was from the cold or from something else entirely. The next morning arrived with the abrupt clarity that follows coastal storms. The sky was stripped clean, pale blue and hard as enamel, and the cliffs steamed gently as the early sun dried the rocks. Blackthorn Castle looked particularly severe in this light, its dark stone towers rising against the sky like blades driven into the earth. Kedrick was in the training yard by 6, stripped to shirt and trousers, working through combat drills with his guard captain, a scarred veteran named Hollis, who had served the duchy for 22 years and feared exactly one man on Earth. The drills were brutal and methodical. Long sword patterns first, then close quarters work with short blades, then grappling sequences designed for the kind of close fighting that happened in corridors and stairwells during sieges. Kedrick trained the way he governed, without mercy, without shortcuts, and with a focus that left no room for the thoughts that hunted him during idle hours. "You are pulling left on the recovery," Hollis said, blocking a strike that would have opened his shoulder in actual combat. "I know. You have known for 3 weeks and have not corrected it." Kedrick reset his stance and attacked again, faster this time, driving Hollis backward across the wet flagstones. The guard captain deflected, redirected, and countered with a sweep that Kedrick barely avoided. "Your mind is somewhere else this morning, Your Grace." "My mind is always somewhere else. That is why I train, to remind the body what the mind forgets." They continued for another 30 minutes before Kedrick called a halt and accepted a cloth to wipe the sweat from his face and neck. His breathing was controlled but heavy. The exertion had burned off the worst of the tension that Pemberton's visit had planted in his chest, but the strategic problem remained. Thornfield. The estate was more than a piece of land. It was the keystone in Blackthorn's defensive architecture, a natural bottleneck that controlled access between the duchy's agricultural heartland and its only deep-water port. Kedrick's father had spent years negotiating for its acquisition before the Thornfield investigation collapsed the previous owners and threw the property into legal limbo. The Crown's receivership had been a compromise, not a solution, and now that compromise was ending. He sent 3 riders before noon, one to his solicitor in London with instructions to obtain every document related to the Thornfield inheritance ruling, one to his intelligence network, a web of paid informants positioned in every major household north of the Thames, with orders to track Marcus Ashcombe's movements and associations, and one to the steward of the Thornfield estate itself, a man named Garrett, who had been maintained on Blackthorn's payroll for the past decade, specifically to ensure that the property remained uninhabitable enough to discourage any potential claimant. The response from Garrett arrived 4 days later, carried by a rider whose horse was lathered and trembling from hard travel. "She is already there." Kedrick read the letter at his desk, and for the first time in months, his jaw tightened with something beyond calculation. Lady Seraphine Vale had arrived at Thornfield 8 days ahead of schedule, accompanied by a single maid and a hired driver. She had found the estate exactly as Garrett had maintained it, roof leaking in 6 places, the east wing entirely unusable, water damage throughout the ground floor, gardens overtaken by years of deliberate neglect. And she had not left. According to Garrett's report, she had spent her first morning walking every room of the manor, making notes in a small leather journal. By afternoon, she had hired 2 local men to begin clearing debris from the main hall. By evening, she had identified the 3 rooms with the soundest roofing and established them as livable quarters for herself and her maid. She had not panicked. She had not wept. She had not sent a single letter requesting assistance or expressing dismay. She had simply assessed the damage and started working. Kedrick set the letter down and stared at the wall of maps behind his desk. His original strategy had been simple: allow the woman to arrive, discover the property was worthless, and then offer to purchase it at a price generous enough to make her departure feel like rescue rather than defeat. Clean, efficient, no confrontation necessary. But a woman who responded to deliberate sabotage with a leather journal and a pair of hired laborers was not going to be rescued from anything. He would have to go to Thornfield himself. The ride took half a day through terrain that shifted from Blackthorn's windswept highlands to the gentler rolling country of the southern border. Kedrick traveled with 4 guards and no banner, wearing riding clothes that carried no insignia. He preferred to arrive without announcement. Announcements gave people time to prepare their faces, and Kedrick had built his reputation on reading the unguarded ones. Thornfield Manor came into view as the road crested a low ridge. Even from a distance, the decay was visible. The stone walls were still structurally sound, built in the same era as Blackthorn itself, but everything above the second floor showed the damage of 11 years without proper maintenance. Missing windows gaped like empty eye sockets. The western chimney had partially collapsed, scattering stone across what had once been a formal garden. The carriage house was a skeleton of exposed beams. But smoke rose from two chimneys on the east side, and someone had cleared the main approach of fallen branches and wheel-breaking ruts. Cadric dismounted at the front entrance and told his guards to wait. The heavy oak door was open, propped with a stone, and from somewhere inside came the sound of a broom against flagstone. He walked through the entrance hall without knocking. The ceiling above was stained with water damage, and plaster had fallen in patches, revealing the original lath beneath. But the floor had been swept clean, and someone had arranged wildflowers in a chipped ceramic jug on the window ledge. The detail stopped him for exactly 2 seconds, not because it was beautiful, but because it was defiant. Flowers in a ruin, a small, deliberate refusal to accept the state of things as they were. He found her in what had once been the manor's study. She was standing on a wooden chair, reaching for a shelf that was slightly beyond comfortable height, pulling down leather-bound ledgers thick with dust. Her dress was plain, dark blue, practical. Her hair was pulled back in a way that prioritized function over appearance. She was smaller than he had expected, built with the kind of lean economy that suggested either discipline or deprivation. And when she heard his boots on the stone floor, she turned with a speed that told him she had been listening for sounds she did not recognize since the moment she arrived. Their eyes met across 12 feet of ruined study, and Caedric experienced something he had not felt in years. Surprise. Not at her appearance, though she was striking in the way that sharp intelligence makes any face compelling. The surprise was simpler and more dangerous than that. She looked at him and did not look away, did not defer, did not show the automatic deference that his presence extracted from nearly every person he encountered. She looked at him the way someone looks at a problem they have been expecting. "You must be the Duke," she said, "and you are trespassing on disputed property." "The courts disagree. The courts are in London. We are not." She stepped down from the chair with the ledger tucked under one arm and faced him squarely. "Lady Seraphine Vale, this estate belonged to my father. It now belongs to me. If you have a legal challenge, I suggest you file it through the proper channels." "I did not ride half a day to discuss legal channels." "Then why did you ride half a day?" The question was delivered without hostility, but with a directness that left no room for the kind of circling, probing conversation that aristocratic encounters typically demanded. Cadric was accustomed to men who buried their intentions beneath layers of courtesy and implication. This woman stripped the game to its bones in her first sentence. He stepped further into the room. "This estate sits on a strategic corridor that my family has controlled for 3 generations. Its transfer to any outside party represents a direct threat to Blackthorn's security. I am here to resolve that threat." Resolve. She set the ledger on the desk without breaking eye contact. That is a very diplomatic word for a man with a reputation for being anything but diplomatic. "You have studied my reputation. I have studied the situation I walked into. Your reputation was unavoidable. Then you know that what I want, I take. And you should know that what I have, I keep." The silence between them lasted 4 full seconds. In Cadric's experience, 4 seconds of direct silence destroyed most people. They filled it with nervous words, conciliatory gestures, retreating body language. Seraphine used it differently. She let the silence exist as a space between 2 equal forces, neither advancing nor retreating, simply holding position. It infuriated him. And underneath the fury, in a place he refused to examine, it fascinated him. "Your father was investigated for treason," Cadric said, choosing the weapon he calculated would cut deepest. "This estate was seized because his activities represented a danger to the crown. You are inheriting a liability, not an asset." Something moved behind Seraphine's eyes. Not pain, though pain was certainly there, buried deep and long controlled. What moved was anger, and it surfaced with the precision of a blade being drawn. "My father was accused," she said, her voice dropping to a register that carried more weight than volume. "Accused by men who benefited from his silence and his removal. He was never convicted. He was never tried. He died in a house in Canterbury with no title, no income, and no opportunity to defend himself. And the men who destroyed him are still sitting in their London townhouses, drinking port and congratulating themselves on their survival." "You believe he was innocent?" I believe the truth was never tested. There is a difference. Kedrick studied her. He had expected defensiveness, possibly desperation. What he got was controlled fury backed by intelligence that was clearly capable of sustaining a long fight. This was not a woman who had come to Thornfield to sell. She had come to dig. "Whatever you think you will find in those ledgers," he said, nodding toward the shelf she had been reaching, "I promise you it is more dangerous than you imagine." "Danger is relative, Your Grace. I have already lost everything once. The second time is significantly less frightening." He held her gaze for another long moment, then turned and walked toward the door. At the threshold, he stopped without looking back. "I will make you an offer for this property. It will be more than generous. I suggest you consider it carefully." "I will consider it the way I consider everything, on its merits and nothing else." He left Thornfield without another word and rode the half-day back to Blackthorn in near total silence, his guards keeping their distance behind him. The wind had shifted to the north, carrying the metallic smell of incoming weather, and by the time the fortress came into view, clouds had gathered along the horizon like an advancing army. In his study that evening, Kedrick poured a glass of whiskey and stood at the window where he had received Pemberton's news. The strategic problem had not changed. Thornfield needed to be secured. But the variables had shifted in ways he had not anticipated. Seraphine Vale was not a pawn. She was not naive. She was not frightened. She had come to Thornfield with the specific intention of finding whatever her father had hidden there, and she possessed the intelligence and the determination to succeed, which meant she was either his greatest potential ally or the most dangerous threat he had faced since his brother's betrayal. And Kedrick Ashcombe did not tolerate uncertainty. He drained the whiskey and sat at his desk. The letter he wrote took 40 minutes. It was addressed to Garrett, his steward at Thornfield, and it contained 3 instructions. First, cease all sabotage of the estate immediately. Second, offer Lady Vale whatever labor and materials she needed to make the manor habitable. Third, report every person who visited, every letter she received, and every book she opened. If she was going to search for her father's secrets, Kedrick intended to know exactly what she found before she understood its value. The real game was not ownership. It had never been about ownership. It was about what was buried in those walls, and whoever controlled that information would control every powerful family in England. 3 days after Kedrick's visit, a rider arrived at Thornfield carrying a sealed letter with the Blackthorn crest. Seraphine opened it at the kitchen table where she had been working through her father's old ledgers since dawn. The offer was extraordinary. 3 times the market value of Thornfield in its current condition, a secondary residence in Bath, an annual stipend sufficient to maintain a comfortable life without dependence on any patron or husband. Every financial anxiety she had carried since her father's ruin could be erased with a single signature. She read the letter twice, set it down, and returned to the ledger she had been examining. Inside the crumbling pages, hidden between columns of mundane household accounts, she had found something that stopped her breath. Entries written in her father's hand using a cipher she recognized from childhood. A simple substitution code he had taught her as a game when she was 8 years old. The entries were dated across a period of 7 years, and as she worked through the first decoded passages, the scope of what her father had documented began to take shape. Names, dates, transactions, a network of payments flowing between some of the most powerful families in England, routed through shell companies and foreign banks, connected to political appointments, judicial decisions, and military contracts. Her father had not been a traitor. He had been a witness. And he had spent years quietly recording every detail of a conspiracy so vast that its exposure would dismantle the foundations of English aristocratic power. Seraphine sat in the cold kitchen of her ruined inheritance and understood with perfect clarity why her father had been destroyed. Not for what he had done, but for what he had known. And now she knew it too. She looked at Kedrick's letter one more time. The generosity of the offer told her everything she needed to know. He suspected. He did not yet know what the ledgers contained, but he understood that Thornfield held something worth more than land, and he was willing to pay an extraordinary premium to ensure he controlled it. She picked up a pen and wrote her response on the back of his own letter. 3 words. Thornfield is not for sale. She sealed it and handed it to the waiting rider. That night, she worked by candlelight until the flame burned down to nothing, decoding entry after entry, and with each line of her father's careful handwriting, the conspiracy grew larger, darker, and more immediate. On the last page of the ledger, in an entry dated just weeks before her father's arrest, she found a name that made her hands stop moving entirely. Ashcombe. Not Carriage. Marcus Ashcombe, the Duke's own brother, listed as a recipient of payments from the same network her father had been accused of serving. The candle guttered and died. Seraphine sat in absolute darkness, holding evidence that could destroy the most powerful duchy in England, and realized that the man who had stood in this very room 3 days ago, threatening her with his authority and his reputation, did not know that his greatest enemy shared his own blood. She was no longer just fighting for an inheritance. She was sitting on a secret that could burn the entire aristocracy to the ground. And the Duke was coming back. Seraphine did not sleep. She sat in the darkness of the Thornfield kitchen long after the candle died, her fingers still resting on the open ledger, feeling the grooves her father's pen had pressed into the paper decades ago. The name had not changed when she struck a match and relit the stub. Marcus Ashcombe. Recipient of 14 separate payments routed through a trading company registered in Amsterdam, each one coinciding with a political appointment or a judicial ruling that benefited the same cluster of families her father had spent years documenting. She closed the ledger at dawn and hid it beneath a loose flagstone in the scullery, a space so damaged by water that no reasonable person would search it. Then she washed her face in cold water from the courtyard well, changed into a clean dress, and went to work clearing debris from the east corridor as though nothing had changed. Everything had changed. The knowledge sat inside her chest like a second heartbeat, heavy and persistent. She understood now why the crown had moved so efficiently against her father, not because he was guilty, but because his guilt was necessary. The men who orchestrated his destruction needed a scapegoat to seal the investigation before anyone looked too closely at where the money actually flowed. Baron Aldrich Vale, a minor nobleman with no powerful allies, had been the perfect sacrifice, quiet enough to disappear without public outcry, principled enough to refuse to trade his evidence for his survival. She had been 11 years old when they came for him. She remembered the sound of boots in the hallway of their London house, the way her mother's face went white and still, the particular quality of silence that falls over a household when authority arrives uninvited. Her father had knelt in front of her and told her to remember that the truth does not stop being true simply because powerful men find it inconvenient. She had not understood those words at 11. She understood them now with a clarity that felt like iron in her bloodstream. The question was what to do with it. The ledger was proof, but proof was only as powerful as the person who wielded it. A woman with no title, no allies, and no political standing could wave documented evidence of aristocratic corruption in front of the entire House of Lords and accomplish nothing except her own destruction. Her father had possessed the same evidence and the same integrity, and the system had ground him into dust without hesitation. She needed leverage, and the most dangerous form of leverage available was standing in Blackthorn Castle, 15 miles north, probably already planning his next move against her. Cedric Ashcombe did not know about his brother's involvement. Seraphine was almost certain of this. The Duke's visit to Thornfield had carried the energy of a man protecting strategic territory, not a man concealing a personal secret. His focus had been entirely on the estate, on the corridor it controlled, on the military and economic implications of its ownership. If he had known that Marcus was entangled in the same conspiracy that destroyed her father, his approach would have been different, more urgent, more violent. Which meant that the information she held could do one of two things. It could destroy Cedric Ashcombe by exposing his family's involvement in a treasonous network, or it could arm him against the brother who had already tried to overthrow him once. Either option required getting closer to the Duke than any sane person would consider advisable. She heard the horses before she saw them. Late morning, the sound carrying across the flat approached to Thornfield with the particular rhythm of a military escort, precise hoofbeats, no wasted energy. She stepped onto the front steps and watched 4 riders crest the ridge, followed by a covered wagon loaded with timber, roofing materials, and what appeared to be several crates of provisions. Garrett, the estate steward she had inherited along with the property, emerged from the carriage house where he had been inventorying tools. His expression was carefully neutral, which told Seraphine everything she needed to know about who had sent the supplies. From Blackthorn, Garrett confirmed, not quite meeting her eyes. His Grace has authorized materials for essential repairs: roofing, structural reinforcement, window glass. He has also sent 2 additional laborers and provisions sufficient for 3 weeks. How generous! Garrett shifted his weight. His Grace is known for his generosity when it serves his interests. Seraphine studied the steward for a long moment. Garrett was in his late 40s, weathered in the way of men who spent their careers managing properties for absent owners. He had been cooperative since her arrival, but his cooperation carried the particular flavor of a man following instructions that originated somewhere other than her authority. "How long have you been reporting to the Duke, Mr. Garrett?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Garrett's face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: surprise, calculation, and finally a resignation that told Seraphine she had been right. 11 years, my lady, since the estate entered receivership. His Grace pays my salary. He has done since the beginning. And your instructions regarding the condition of this property? Garrett swallowed. To ensure it remained uninviting to potential claimants. The leaking roof, the collapsed chimney, the water damage. Yes, my lady. Seraphine felt the anger rise and deliberately let it settle. Anger at Garrett was wasted energy. He was a tool, and tools bore no moral responsibility for how they were wielded. The man holding the handle was 15 miles north. Your new instructions from the Duke? To assist you fully, to provide whatever resources you require, and to... He trailed off. To report everything I do. Yes, my lady. She looked at the wagon full of supplies, then back at Garrett. The Duke had made his calculation transparent, probably intentionally. He was offering comfort and assistance while maintaining surveillance. It was the kind of strategy that revealed how a man's mind worked. Generosity as a delivery mechanism for control. Unload the supplies, she said. Begin with the East Wing roofing. And Mr. Garrett, you may continue your reports to the Duke. Tell him exactly what you see. I have nothing to hide. It was a lie, of course. She had everything to hide. But the most effective lies were the ones built on the scaffold of visible honesty, and Seraphine had learned that particular architecture from a master. Her father had hidden his most dangerous secrets inside household ledgers, precisely because no one expected treason to live between entries for candle wax and flour. The repairs began that afternoon. Seraphine worked alongside the laborers, clearing rubble and sorting salvageable materials from wreckage with her sleeves rolled above her elbows and dust in her hair. She had learned physical labor in Canterbury, where her aunt's modest household could not afford servants for heavy work, and the skill served her now in ways that went beyond practicality. The laborers, local men who had expected an aristocratic woman to stand aside and point, watched her lift stones and haul timber with an expression that shifted gradually from surprise to something quieter and more durable. By the 3rd day, they had stopped waiting for her instructions and started anticipating her decisions. On the 4th day, Cadric came back. He arrived alone this time. No guards, no escort, just a single rider on a dark horse, approaching Thornfield from the northern road at a pace that suggested deliberation rather than urgency. Seraphine saw him from the 2nd-floor window, where she had been examining a water-stained wall, and felt her pulse accelerate in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the particular tension of holding a secret that could reshape the entire landscape between them. She met him at the front entrance. He dismounted and stood in the afternoon light, and she noticed things she had been too focused to register during their first encounter. The way he carried tension in his shoulders rather than his face, keeping his expression controlled while his body absorbed the strain. The precise economy of his movements, nothing wasted, nothing performed. The faint scar along his left jawline that spoke of a history more physical than his title would suggest. You declined my offer, he said. I did. The terms were more than fair. Fairness is not the issue. Then what is? This is my home. One does not sell a home because a neighbor finds it strategically inconvenient. Cadric's jaw tightened by a fraction. I am significantly more than a neighbor. And I am significantly more than an inconvenience. Yet here we are, both reducing the other to simple terms because the complicated ones are harder to manage. Something shifted in his expression. Not softening, Cadric Ashcombe did not soften, but a recalibration, the kind of adjustment a chess player makes when an opponent reveals a level of skill that demands a different strategy. "Walk with me," he said. It was not a request, but it was not quite a command either. It occupied the narrow space between the two that powerful men inhabit when they encounter someone who has earned the right to refuse. They walked the perimeter of the estate, following a path that wound through the overgrown gardens and along the stone wall that marked Thornfield's eastern boundary. The wall was crumbling in places, gaps showing where stones had tumbled into the tall grass, but the line it traced was clear enough to follow. "Your steward tells me you have been examining your father's old records," Cadric said as they passed through a section where the wall had collapsed entirely. "Household accounts, supply records, the ordinary paperwork of estate management. And have you found anything of interest in this ordinary paperwork?" She looked at him. The question was a trap laid with professional precision, and they both knew it. He was testing whether she would lie, deflect, or reveal. Each response would give him different information about her capabilities and her intentions. She chose a fourth option, the truth, stripped of its most dangerous element. "I found records suggesting that my father's financial dealings were entirely consistent with legitimate estate management, nothing that supports the charges brought against him." "That must be reassuring." "It is confirmation of what I already knew." Cadric stopped walking. They had reached the eastern edge of the property where the ground dropped away into a shallow valley, and from this vantage point, the landscape stretched north toward Blackthorn's territories. His fortress was not visible from here, hidden behind the ridgeline, but its presence saturated the geography. Every road, every field, every village in sight operated under his authority, and the transition from his domain to hers was marked by nothing more than a stone wall that could barely stand upright. "Let me be direct," he said, turning to face her. "I do not believe you came here for a house. People can want more than one thing. They can. But they rarely risk everything for a property in ruins unless the ruins contain something worth the risk." His eyes held hers with an intensity that felt physical, like pressure against her sternum. "What are you looking for, Lady Vale?" "Justice." The word hung in the air between them. Cadric studied her face with the focus of a man reading a document written in a language he almost understood. "Justice," he repeated. "That is an expensive pursuit, especially for someone without resources or allies. I have one resource you have not accounted for." "Which is?" "The truth. And unlike money or political connections, the truth does not depreciate when powerful men decide it is inconvenient." Cadric was quiet for several seconds. The wind moved through the valley below them, bending the tall grass in waves that looked like breath. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to the register she was beginning to recognize as his most honest, the one he used when control required more effort than usual. "My brother is in London. He has been meeting with people who want me removed from Blackthorn. I do not say this to gain your sympathy. I say it because you need to understand that whatever you think you are walking into, the reality is worse. The men who destroyed your father are not finished. They are actively maneuvering, and you, whether you intend it or not, are standing in the center of their chessboard. Perhaps I prefer to be a player rather than a piece." "Players get killed. Pieces get sacrificed. I have been sacrificed once already. I did not care for it." The look that crossed Cadric's face was unlike anything she had seen from him. Not respect, exactly. Something raw, recognition. The expression of a man seeing his own survival instinct reflected in someone else's eyes for the first time. "If you find something in those records," he said slowly, each word chosen with the deliberation of a man placing stones on a wall he knows might collapse, "something that extends beyond your father's case, something that involves families still in power, you will need protection that goes beyond a crumbling stone wall and a steward with divided loyalties." "Is that an offer?" "It is a fact." "Facts and offers are different things, Your Grace. Facts require no reciprocity." "Everything requires reciprocity. That is not cynicism. It is the mechanical truth of how power operates. No one protects anything for free. The question is always what the protection costs and whether the price is worth paying." She met his gaze without flinching. "And what would your protection cost?" "Access to whatever you find, before anyone else sees it." There it was. The transaction laid bare. He wanted the information, and he was willing to trade his considerable power for the privilege of controlling it. It was not a generous offer or a manipulative one. It was the offer of a man who understood that information was the only form of power that could not be taken by force. "I will consider it," she said. "Do not consider too long. My patience is not unlimited, and my enemies do not operate on your schedule." He left Thornfield for the second time, and Seraphine watched him ride north until the horse and rider disappeared behind the ridge. Then she went back inside, descended to the scullery, lifted the loose flagstone, and retrieved the ledger. She worked through the night again, decoding entries with increasing speed as the cipher became automatic. By midnight, the scope of the conspiracy had expanded beyond anything she had imagined. It was not a simple network of bribery and influence. It was a parallel government, a shadow structure that had been directing policy, appointments, and military decisions for nearly 2 decades. The families involved included 3 dukes, 7 earls, a dozen barons, and at least 4 sitting members of parliament. The money flowed through Amsterdam, then Geneva, then back to London through a series of trading companies that existed only on paper. And Marcus Ashcombe was not merely a participant, he was a coordinator. The ledger entries showed him as the primary intermediary between the English families and their foreign financial partners. He had been facilitating the movement of money and influence since before his brother inherited the dukedom, and his failed attempt to have Carriage declared unfit suddenly took on a different dimension. It had not been a personal vendetta. It had been a strategic operation to install a puppet duke who could provide cover for the network's activities. At 2 a.m, Seraphine decoded an entry that made her set down her pen and close her eyes. A payment dated 6 weeks before her father's arrest, routed from Marcus Ashcombe's network to the office of the magistrate who had signed the warrant. The amount was substantial. The purpose, recorded in her father's meticulous shorthand, was explicit. Silence the witness before the autumn session of Parliament. Her father had known they were coming for him. He had documented the payment that funded his own destruction and then hidden the evidence inside a cipher that only his daughter would recognize. He had trusted her to find it. He had trusted her to be strong enough to use it. She opened her eyes and stared at the candlelight flickering against the scullery wall. The shadows moved like living things, like the shapes of all the men who had conspired to erase her father from history and were now conspiring to reshape England's power structure in their own image. 3 days later, a letter arrived from London that changed everything. It bore no seal and no signature. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The message was short. "Lady Vale, your presence at Thornfield has been noted by parties who do not share the Duke of Blackthorn's restraint. You have what your father had. They know this. Leave the estate within 7 days or the matter will be resolved by methods the courts cannot review." She read it once, folded it carefully, and placed it inside the ledger. Then she wrote 2 letters of her own. The first was addressed to a solicitor in London, a man her aunt had mentioned once as someone who had quietly tried to defend her father before political pressure made the case untouchable. The letter contained no specifics, only a request for a meeting and a reference to her father's name that would tell the solicitor everything he needed to know about why she was writing. The second letter was addressed to Carriage Ashcombe, Duke of Blackthorn. It was shorter than the first. "Your Grace, I accept your terms. I have access to the information you seek. In return, I require your protection, effective immediately. What I have found involves your family directly. The threat is closer than you know, and it is already moving. I will explain everything in person. Come to Thornfield at your earliest opportunity. Come alone. S.V." She sealed both letters and sent them with separate riders, one south to London, one north to Blackthorn. Then she went upstairs to the room she had made habitable and lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling where water stains mapped shapes that looked like continents. She had just invited the most dangerous man in England into a conspiracy against his own brother, armed with evidence that could topple the aristocracy, while unknown enemies had given her 7 days to disappear or die. There was no going back from this. The letter was already riding north. By morning, Carriage would know everything, and nothing between them, nothing between any of them, would ever be the same. Carriage read Seraphine's letter standing at his desk, and the words rearranged the architecture of everything he thought he understood. Not slowly, not in stages, but all at once, the way a single crack in a foundation can reveal that the entire structure has been compromised for years. Your family, The threat is closer than you know. He read it again, then a third time. His breathing did not change, his hands did not shake, but something behind his ribs shifted with the grinding precision of tectonic plates finding a new alignment, and the sound that came out of him was not a word, but a single exhaled breath that carried more weight than any sentence he had spoken in years. Marcus. He did not need Seraphine to spell it out. The moment she wrote "your family," the rest assembled itself with the ruthless logic of a puzzle that had been sitting half-completed on his desk for 3 years, waiting for the one piece he had refused to pick up. Marcus meeting with London financiers. Marcus seen in the company of the Duke of Ashford. Marcus pushing for the competency hearing that would have stripped Cadric of his authority and installed a council of regents, a council that Marcus would have controlled. Cadric had told himself that his brother's betrayal was personal. Jealousy. Resentment. The corrosive bitterness of a second son who believed primogeniture had cheated him. He had processed it as a family wound, cauterized it, filed it in the part of himself where damaged things were stored and sealed. And in doing so, he had made the most dangerous mistake a strategist could make. He had underestimated the scope of the threat because acknowledging its true dimensions meant acknowledging that his own blood had been working against him, not out of spite, but as part of something systematic, organized, and vastly larger than fraternal rivalry. He left Blackthorn before dawn, riding south through darkness that smelled of wet earth and the last traces of coastal fog. He brought no guards. Seraphine's letter had said alone, and for reasons he was not prepared to examine, he trusted the instruction. Not her, not yet, but the instruction itself. A woman who had survived what she survived and still had the precision to write "come alone" was operating on information that justified the risk. Trusting her judgment cost less than arriving with an escort and watching her close the door on everything she knew. The ride to Thornfield took 4 hours in the pre-dawn darkness, and Cadric used every minute of it. His mind worked the way it always worked under threat, not in straight lines but in branching architectures, mapping every possibility and assigning weight to each one. If Marcus was embedded in a conspiracy that extended across the aristocracy, the competency hearing had been a surgical strike designed to neutralize Blackthorn's independence before the network's activities were exposed. It had failed because Cadric still maintained enough allies in the House of Lords to block it. But failure did not mean surrender. It meant escalation. And the anonymous letter Seraphine had received, the one threatening violence if she did not abandon Thornfield within 7 days, was exactly the kind of escalation that men resorted to when political mechanisms stopped working. He arrived at Thornfield as the first gray light broke over the eastern ridge. The manor looked different in this light, less ruined and more defiant, its surviving chimneys trailing smoke against a sky that had not decided whether to clear or cloud over. The repairs Seraphine had begun were visible even from the approach. New timber framing and 2 ground-floor windows. The main entrance cleared and reinforced. A vegetable garden, barely started but unmistakable in its intent, marked out beside the kitchen wall. She was not building a temporary shelter. She was establishing a position. Seraphine opened the door before he reached it, which meant she had been watching for him, which meant she had slept as little as he had. She was dressed in the same practical style he had seen before. Dark fabric, simple construction, nothing decorative, and her face carried the particular expression of a person who has spent the night holding a decision so heavy that releasing it required a conscious act of will. "Inside," she said. Not a greeting, an operational instruction. He followed her through the entrance hall and down a narrow corridor to the scullery, a room he would never have chosen for a conversation of this magnitude. It was damp, utilitarian, lit by a single window set too high in the wall. But when she knelt and lifted a loose flagstone from the floor, he understood why she had chosen it. This was where the evidence lived, in the most overlooked, most damaged room of a ruined estate, exactly where her father had intended it to survive. She placed the ledger on the wooden table that occupied the center of the room and opened it to the first coded page. My father used a substitution cipher, simple enough for a child to learn. He taught it to me when I was 8 as a game. It is the reason the investigators never found this. They were looking for hidden compartments and secret correspondence. They were not looking for a code disguised as household accounts. Cadric looked at the page. Columns of numbers, notations in a steady hand, the mundane architecture of estate bookkeeping. And beneath it, invisible to anyone who did not hold the key, a record of systematic corruption spanning nearly 2 decades. "Show me." She decoded the first entry aloud, translating the cipher into names, dates, and transaction amounts with the fluency of someone who had been living inside these pages for days. Cadric listened without interrupting. The first 3 entries involved families he had suspected of financial manipulation, but could never prove. The 4th named a sitting member of parliament. The 5th named 2. By the time she reached the 7th entry, his hands were flat on the table, pressing down as though the wood itself might shift beneath him. "Marcus Ashcombe," she said, and paused to let the name land. 14 payments received through a trading company registered in Amsterdam. Corresponding dates align with the Duke of Ashford's appointment to the Privy Council, the dismissal of 3 judicial inquiries into shipping fraud, and the suppression of a military audit that would have exposed procurement corruption in the northern garrisons. Kedrick's face did not move. His body did not move. But behind his eyes, something was being demolished with controlled, systematic violence, the way combat engineers bring down a structure they can no longer defend. He was dismantling his own assumptions about his brother, about his family, about the nature of the threat he faced, and rebuilding the strategic landscape from the ground up, while the woman across the table watched him do it. "How far does it go?" His voice was level, but the effort required to keep it there was visible in the cords of his neck. 20 years of documentation, 3 dukes, 7 earls, a dozen barons, 4 members of parliament. Your brother is not a peripheral figure. He is the intermediary, the connector between the English families and their foreign financial architecture. Without him, the money does not move. "And my father?" The question came out before he could stop it, and the fact that he asked it told Seraphine more about Cadric Ashcombe than any intelligence report could have provided. The Duke of Blackthorn, the man who had built his entire identity on control and strategic clarity, had just revealed the one fear he could not calculate his way around, that the rot extended beyond his brother, that the foundation he stood on had been compromised from the beginning. "Your father is not mentioned anywhere in these records. Neither are you." She watched the information hit him. Not relief, nothing so clean as that, but a fractional release of tension in his shoulders that suggested he had been bracing for a blow that did not come. The Ashcombe dukedom was not built on corruption. Only one Ashcombe had been corrupted, and that distinction, narrow as it was, gave Cadric something to stand on while the rest of the ground collapsed. "The payment that funded your father's arrest," he said. "Show me." She turned to the final pages and translated the entry. A sum routed from Marcus Ashcombe's network to the magistrate's office 6 weeks before Baron Vale was taken from his home. Purpose documented in her father's shorthand. Silence the witness. Kedrick read the decoded entry 3 times. When he looked up, his expression had changed in a way that Seraphine recognized from the only other time she had seen a man reach the absolute limit of what he could absorb without breaking. It was not rage, though rage was there, compressed and controlled. It was the expression of a man who had just been forced to accept that the person he had loved as a child, fought with as a young man, and exiled as an adult was not merely disloyal, but actively, strategically, relentlessly destructive. "Your brother did not try to remove you because he wanted Blackthorn," Seraphine said quietly. "He tried to remove you because you are the one person with enough power and independence to threaten the network. A puppet duke installed by the conspiracy would have provided cover for another generation. You were the obstacle." Kedrick pushed back from the table and stood. He walked to the narrow window and stared up at the strip of sky visible through the glass. His jaw worked silently for several seconds, the muscles flexing and releasing with the mechanical rhythm of a man processing something that exceeded the capacity of language. 3 years, he said finally. "I have spent 3 years believing my brother's betrayal was personal, believing he was weak, envious, broken by the weight of being second. I built an entire understanding of what happened based on that belief, and I was wrong. Not partially wrong, completely wrong. I assigned him a human motive when his actual motive was operational. He was not trying to hurt me. He was trying to neutralize me. The difference is everything." He turned from the window and looked at Seraphine with an intensity that felt like standing too close to a fire. "Who else has seen this ledger?" "No one." I decoded it alone. The solicitor you wrote to in London. She stiffened. How do you know about that? Garrett reported it. A letter sent south by a separate writer from the one that carried your message to me. I assumed it was legal correspondence. Was it? I contacted a man who once tried to defend my father. I did not send details, only my name and a request to meet. His name? Edmund Hale. Something crossed Kedrick's face. A flash of recognition followed immediately by something harder. Edmund Hale represented your father. Tried to. He was pressured to withdraw before the case could be heard. Hale is dead, Lady Vale. The scullery went silent. Not the comfortable silence of a pause in conversation, but the airless silence of a room from which all possibility of a certain kind of future has been suddenly and permanently removed. When? Seraphine's voice came out flat, stripped of everything except the need to know. 8 months ago. A fall from his horse, according to the official account. He was found on a road outside Reading with a broken neck. No witnesses. Seraphine sat down. Not because her legs gave way, but because the act of sitting was the only form of control available to her in a moment when the world was contracting around her like a fist. Edmund Hale. The one man in the legal establishment who had shown the courage to stand near her father's case. Dead on a road outside Reading with the convenient tidiness of an accident that answered every question except the ones that mattered. They're cleaning the board, Kedrick said. Everyone connected to your father's evidence is being removed. Hale was one. You are next. The letter you received gave you 7 days, which means they have already decided to act, and the timeline is a courtesy designed to give you a chance to disappear quietly before they have to escalate. I am not going to disappear. No, you are not, because you are going to give me that ledger, and I am going to use it to destroy them. The ledger stays with me. The statement hit the room like a physical object. Kedrick turned fully toward her, and for a moment the raw force of his personality filled the scullery with a pressure that made the stone walls feel closer. You do not understand what you are holding. I understand exactly what I am holding. It is the only reason I am still alive, and the only reason you are standing in this kitchen instead of sending your steward to negotiate my departure. The moment I hand this ledger to you, I become irrelevant. And irrelevant people in this situation have a life expectancy measured in weeks. Kedrick stared at her. The anger in his face was real, but beneath it, something else was working, the grinding recalculation of a man who had just been outmaneuvered by logic he could not refute. She was right. The ledger was her only leverage, and surrendering it would transform her from a strategic necessity into a loose end. He would not harm her. He was many things, but not that. Yet the conspirators would. And without the ledger in her possession, his incentive to protect her diminished from essential to optional. Then what do you propose? The words came through his teeth like something that cost him to release. A partnership. Not your protection in exchange for my information. A genuine alliance. I decode the ledger, you deploy the intelligence. We move against the network together, and when it is finished, Thornfield remains mine, free of any claim or pressure from Blackthorn, and my father's name is cleared publicly. You are negotiating with me. I am offering you the only arrangement that keeps both of us alive long enough to accomplish anything. The silence that followed lasted longer than any of their previous ones. Kedrick studied her face with the exhaustive attention of a man reading a treaty he was being asked to sign without amendment. Every line, every implication, every hidden cost. You realize that the moment I act on this intelligence, I am declaring war on half the aristocracy, including my own brother. There is no partial version of this. It is total exposure or nothing. I know. And you are prepared for what that means, for both of us. I have been preparing for this since I was 11 years old and watched them take my father. He extended his hand. Not the formal gesture of aristocratic agreement, but the blunt, direct grip of a man sealing a compact in the only currency he trusted. Physical contact, eye contact, the weight of a commitment made in a room where the evidence of 20 years of conspiracy lay open on a wooden table. She took his hand. Her grip was firm and dry and lasted exactly as long as it needed to. We start with Ashford, Kedrick said, releasing her hand and moving immediately into operational mode. He is the weakest link, the most dependent on Marcus's financial architecture. If we isolate him first, the network loses its southern anchor, and Marcus loses his most valuable ally. I will need the decoded entries for Ashford's transactions within 2 days. You will have them by tomorrow night. He turned toward the door, then stopped. The 7-day deadline in that letter, when does it expire? 4 days from now. I will have men at Thornfield by nightfall, not Garrett's laborers, my personal guard. The estate becomes a protected position as of today. Your enemies will notice. My enemies already know where you are and what you have. Visibility is no longer a risk. Isolation is. He left Thornfield riding north at a pace that punished the horse and served no strategic purpose except to burn through the violence that was building in his chest. Marcus, his brother. The boy he had wrestled with in the halls of Blackthorn, the young man who had stood beside him at their father's funeral, the adult who had smiled at him across a courtroom while petitioning to have him declared unfit. Every memory was now contaminated by a truth so much larger and so much uglier than jealousy that Carriage felt physically ill as the pieces assembled themselves into a picture he could no longer refuse to see. Marcus had paid for the arrest of an innocent man, had coordinated the financial architecture of a conspiracy that corrupted the judiciary, manipulated military procurement, and controlled political appointments across a generation, had tried to remove Kedrick not out of fraternal hatred, but as a strategic operation to secure the network's continued impunity. And Kedrick had missed it. For 3 years he had been so focused on the personal wound that he never examined the institutional one. He had treated his brother's betrayal as a family matter when it was an act of systemic warfare, and that failure of perception had cost time, cost lives, and nearly cost him everything. He reached Blackthorn by midday and went directly to his study. Hollis was waiting, alerted by the scouts who had tracked the Duke's departure before dawn. Mobilize a detachment of 12, my best, armed for extended deployment. They ride to Thornfield within the hour and establish a defensive perimeter. Hollis did not ask questions. He had served Kedrick long enough to distinguish between orders that permitted discussion and orders that did not. Rules of engagement? Anyone approaching Thornfield without my explicit authorization is to be detained. If they resist, escalate without restraint. Hollis left. Kedrick sat at his desk and began writing. Letters to his solicitors instructing them to obtain property records for every estate connected to the Duke of Ashford. Correspondence to 3 members of the House of Lords, whose loyalty he had tested over years and found durable. A formal request to the Master of the Rolls for access to the judicial records surrounding the Thornfield investigation. He worked for 4 hours without stopping. The strategic framework was clear. Dismantle the network from the outside in, starting with the most vulnerable members, building an evidentiary case so comprehensive that no amount of political pressure could suppress it. Use Seraphine's decoded intelligence as the foundation and supplement it with contemporary evidence that would corroborate her father's records and eliminate any defense based on their age. It was sound, methodical, exactly the kind of campaign Kedrick excelled at, and it fell apart in a single evening. The messenger arrived at Blackthorn just after sunset, riding a horse that was foaming and staggering with exhaustion. Hollis brought him directly to the study. From London, Your Grace. Lord Fairfax's household. Lord Fairfax was the most senior of the 3 allies Kedrick had written to that morning. His letter had not even reached London yet, which meant Fairfax was sending this message unprompted. Kedrick broke the seal. The letter was short. Fairfax's handwriting, normally precise, showed the tremor of haste or fear. Ashcombe, your brother appeared before the Privy Council this morning with a formal petition. He claims to possess evidence that you have entered into a treasonous conspiracy with the daughter of convicted traitor Baron Aldrich Vale. He alleges you are harboring a fugitive on a seized crown property and have deployed personal military forces to prevent lawful investigation. The Council has authorized a formal inquiry. The Lord Chancellor has issued a summons for your appearance within 14 days. Your accounts and correspondence are subject to immediate audit. I write as a friend. Your position is more precarious than you know. Marcus did not act alone. He had supporters on the council who were prepared for this petition before he delivered it. This was not improvised. It was planned. Destroy this letter. Kedrick set the paper down with a steadiness that required every ounce of discipline he had accumulated over 34 years. His brother had moved first. Everything, the alliance with Seraphine, the strategic plan to dismantle the network, the decoded evidence, the mobilization of his guard, had been anticipated. Marcus had not been waiting in London out of exile's impotence. He had been waiting for exactly this, for Caedric to make contact with the woman at Thornfield, to commit himself visibly and irrevocably to her cause, to deploy military resources in a way that could be reframed as aggression against the crown. And someone had told him. Someone inside Blackthorn, inside Caedric's own household, had communicated his movements to his brother with enough speed and detail to allow Marcus to prepare a preemptive strike before Caedric's own letters reached London. The spy was not Garrett. Garrett's reports went to Blackthorn, and Marcus had no access to Blackthorn's internal correspondence. The information had come from someone closer, someone who had watched Caedric leave before dawn, ride south alone, and return in a state of urgency that told its own story. Someone inside the fortress. Caedric stood at his desk and felt the ground shift beneath him in a way that had nothing to do with physical sensation. Every person in this castle, every guard, every servant, and every advisor who had access to his movements was now a suspect. The walls he had spent years fortifying were not walls at all. They were a cage, and the door had been open from the inside for longer than he wanted to calculate. He looked at Fairfax's letter one more time, memorized the critical details, and held the paper over the candle flame until it curled into black ash that drifted to the stone floor like the remains of every assumption he had ever made about the safety of his own domain. 14 days. That was how long he had before the formal inquiry convened. 14 days to identify the traitor inside Blackthorn, secure the evidence at Thornfield, dismantle a conspiracy that had been building for 20 years, and defend himself against charges manufactured by his own brother. And he had to do all of it knowing that every move he made within his own walls was being watched and reported by someone he trusted. The man who had walked into Thornfield that morning, believing he could control this situation through strategy and overwhelming force, no longer existed. That man had been built on the assumption that his home was secure, that his inner circle was loyal, that the only enemies he faced were external. That man was gone. What remained was something harder and more dangerous. A duke stripped of every certainty except one. That survival now required becoming something he had never been. Not a ruler commanding from a position of strength, but a hunted man fighting from inside a compromised position with allies he could count on one hand and enemies embedded in the walls around him. He crossed to the window and looked out at the dark courtyard of Blackthorn Castle, the fortress he had inherited, defended, and believed was impregnable. It had never been impregnable. It had only been waiting for the right person to open the gate from within. And the gate was already open. Caedric did not sleep that night. He sat in his darkened study with every candle extinguished, the only light coming from the cold moonlight that cut through the narrow window and painted a thin blade of silver across the stone floor. He sat in the darkness because darkness was honest. It did not pretend to show you things that were not there. It simply admitted that visibility was gone and left you alone with the architecture of your own mind. The traitor was inside Blackthorn. That fact restructured everything. Every conversation he had held in this room, every letter he had dictated, every order he had issued to Hollis or his stewards or his council was potentially compromised. The question was not whether information had been leaking to Marcus. The question was how long it had been leaking and how much of Caedric's strategic advantage had been hollow from the beginning. He began the process the way he had been trained to process battlefield intelligence. Eliminate the impossible first. The spy had to have access to his personal movements, not just his official schedule, but his unannounced departures. His ride to Thornfield before dawn had been observed and reported to London fast enough for Marcus to prepare a Privy Council petition within hours. That speed required either a rider dispatched immediately after Caedric's departure or a pre-established communication system, pigeons, signal fires, a relay chain that could transmit information faster than a man on horseback. The second option was more likely and significantly more terrifying. It meant the surveillance infrastructure had been built over time, maintained with resources and planning, which meant the spy was not an opportunist. The spy was an operative. By 3 in the morning, Cadric had reduced his suspect list to 11 people. By 4, he had reduced it to 5. By the time the first gray light appeared in the eastern sky, he had reduced it to 2. Garrett was the obvious candidate, but Kedric's instinct rejected the obvious. Garrett was a tool, paid and managed, with no ideological commitment to either side. He reported to whoever signed his wages, and his wages came from Blackthorn. Converting him would require either a payment large enough to overcome his pragmatic loyalty or leverage significant enough to compel him. Neither was impossible, but Garrett's position at Thornfield, 15 miles from the castle, made him a poor source for intelligence about Cadric's dawn movements. The other candidate made Cadric's stomach clench with a nausea that had nothing to do with hunger. Hollis, his guard captain. 22 years of service. The man who trained with him every morning, who commanded his personal security, who knew his movements before anyone else in the castle because his job required it. Cadric rejected the idea with immediate, visceral force. Then he made himself sit with it, made himself strip away the emotional resistance, and examine the possibility with the same clinical detachment he would apply to any intelligence assessment. Hollis had access. Hollis had opportunity. Hollis had been present for every significant movement Cadric had made in the past 3 years, including the pre-dawn ride to Thornfield that had triggered Marcus's petition. But access and opportunity were not proof. They were geometry. And Cadric needed proof before he could act, because acting on suspicion against a man who had served him for 2 decades would destroy something inside the castle that could never be rebuilt, regardless of whether the suspicion proved correct. He needed to set a trap. The plan took shape with the brutal efficiency of a man who had spent his entire adult life thinking in terms of controlled information. He would create 3 separate pieces of false intelligence, each one plausible, each one strategically significant, and deliver each piece to a different member of his inner circle through channels that ensured only the intended recipient would receive it. Whichever piece of false intelligence reached Marcus first would identify the spy with mathematical certainty. To Hollis, he would confide that he planned to move Seraphine and the ledger from Thornfield to a safe house in York within 3 days. To his chief steward, a man named Aldridge, who managed the castle's domestic operations, he would mention that Seraphine had agreed to sell Thornfield and that the transaction would be completed by week's end. To his solicitor's representative in the castle, a clerk named Whitmore who handled correspondence, he would dictate a letter suggesting that the ledger contained nothing of substance and that the entire Thornfield situation was a strategic distraction designed to draw Marcus into the open. 3 stories. 3 recipients. 1 truth that would surface like blood through bandages. He set the trap that morning. He found Hollis in the armory, inspecting weapons for the Thornfield detachment. The guard captain looked up with the steady, unremarkable expression of a man performing routine duties, and Cadric felt the particular agony of studying a face he had trusted for 2 decades and not knowing whether the trust was justified. "Change of plans for the Thornfield deployment," Cadric said, keeping his voice at the operational register that Hollis would expect. "Lady Vale and the materials she has recovered will be relocated to York. I have a property there that is unknown to London. The move happens in 3 days, before dawn. I need a transport detail that can cover 40 miles without stopping and a rear guard to sanitize Thornfield after departure." Hollis absorbed the information without visible reaction. "York is exposed. The roads north pass through territory controlled by families aligned with your brother. Which is why the detail needs to be prepared for armed resistance. I want your 12 best, full combat load, no identifying insignia." "Understood. I will have the detail ready by the night of the 2nd day." Cadric held Hollis's gaze for 2 seconds longer than necessary. The guard captain did not flinch, did not look away, did not exhibit any of the micro-expressions that Cadric had spent a lifetime learning to read. Either Hollis was innocent, or he was the most disciplined liar Cadric had ever encountered. Both possibilities were equally credible, and that ambiguity was the cruelest part. He delivered the 2nd and 3rd pieces of false intelligence within the hour, calibrating each conversation to sound natural, unrehearsed, and consistent with the recipient's role. Then he waited. The answer came in 36 hours. Faster than he expected. Fast enough to confirm that the communication system between Blackthorn and London was not a single rider, but something more sophisticated, more embedded, more permanent. A message arrived from Fairfax in London, sent through the emergency channel they had established years ago. Marcus Ashcombe had appeared before his allies on the Privy Council with updated intelligence. He claimed the Duke of Blackthorn was planning to move the fugitive Lady Vale and stolen crown evidence to a hidden location in York within 72 hours. He demanded the council authorize an intercept force to seize the evidence before it disappeared. York. The information Caedric had given to Hollis. Only Hollis. Caedric read Fairfax's message in his study, and the world narrowed to a single point of absolute clarity. The kind of clarity that comes only when every comforting illusion has been stripped away and what remains is so stark and so simple that it requires no interpretation. Hollis, 22 years, the man who had taught him half of what he knew about combat, the man who had stood beside him during Marcus's competency challenge and testified before the House of Lords that the Duke was sound, capable, and fit to govern. The man who had sparred with him every morning and corrected his left side recovery 3 weeks ago with the patience of someone who still cared whether his Duke survived a real fight. And underneath all of it, for how long Caedric could not yet determine, a traitor. The nausea hit him then, not the abstract discomfort of strategic setback, but the physical, gut-deep revulsion of a man whose body was rejecting a truth that his mind had already accepted. He gripped the edge of his desk until his knuckles whitened, breathing through his nose in controlled draws that kept the sickness below the threshold of his throat. He would not vomit. He would not break. He would process this the way he processed everything, by converting pain into action, because a man who stands still while bleeding will die. And Caedric Ashcombe had decided a long time ago that death would have to earn him. He sent a rider to Thornfield within the hour. The message was brief and written in a cipher he had developed himself, one that no one in Blackthorn had ever seen. Thornfield. Compromise confirmed inside the castle. Guard captain. Do not share any information with anyone bearing Blackthorn insignia except me personally. I'm coming tonight. Prepare to move. Seraphine received the message at midday and decoded it in 11 minutes using the key Caedric had left with her during their alliance meeting. She read it twice, burned it, and began packing the ledger and her decoded notes into a leather satchel that she could carry on her person without assistance. The confirmation of a spy inside Blackthorn did not surprise her as much as it should have. She had grown up in the wreckage of betrayal. Her father's entire world had been demolished by men he trusted, and the lesson she had absorbed from that demolition was not bitterness, but operational clarity. Trust was a resource, not a right. It had to be tested, maintained, and periodically audited like any other asset. And when it failed the audit, you did not mourn its loss. You replaced it with something more reliable. She was in the scullery, securing the last of the decoded documents, when she heard movement outside the kitchen window that did not match the rhythm of Caedric's guard detail. 3 men, moving through the overgrown garden on the east side of the manor, using the wall as cover. They were not wearing Blackthorn colors. They were not wearing any identifiable livery at all. They carried short blades and moved with the economy of professionals who had done this kind of work before. Seraphine's body reacted before her mind finished processing the information. She grabbed the satchel, secured it across her chest, and moved through the corridor toward the main hall where Caedric's guards were stationed. Her footsteps were quick but controlled. Running invited panic, and panic was a luxury she could not afford. She reached the main hall to find 2 of Caedric's guards already alert, hands on weapons, eyes fixed on the courtyard entrance. The third was positioned at the upper window of the stairwell, scanning the approach road. 3 on the east side, Seraphine said, coming through the garden, no livery. The senior guard, a man named Brennan, whose face bore the permanent tan and fine scars of someone who had spent more years in the field than in garrison, processed the information with a nod. Fletcher, east corridor, cover the kitchen entrance. Ward, hold the main door. My lady, upstairs. Second room on the left has a barricade we set on the first night. Lock yourself in. I'm not locking myself anywhere. The evidence I carry is the only thing keeping any of us relevant to the people who sent those men. If I hide and they breach the house, they will find me regardless. If I stay visible and mobile, I am a harder target. Brennan stared at her for a full second, then made a tactical decision that would have gotten him disciplined under normal chain of command. Stay behind me. Move when I move. Stop when I stop. Do not speak. The first attack came through the kitchen. Two men breached the rear entrance simultaneously, blades drawn, moving in the coordinated pattern of trained operatives. Fletcher met the first with a block that rang through the stone corridor like a bell struck with iron. The second got past him by 3 steps before Brennan intercepted, driving the attacker against the wall with a forearm strike that cracked plaster. Seraphine pressed her back against the corridor wall and watched violence happen at close range with a detachment that frightened her. Not because she did not feel fear, the fear was there, acidic and alive in her stomach, but because the fear did not translate into paralysis. It translated into observation. She watched the angles, the footwork, the way each combatant used the narrow corridor to limit the other's movement. She cataloged the information the way she cataloged cipher patterns, automatically, compulsively, because understanding the mechanics of a threat was the first step towards surviving it. The kitchen attackers were subdued in less than 2 minutes. Brennan's men were better, a fact that Seraphine filed away as evidence of Carriage's investment in personnel quality. But the third attacker from the garden had not appeared, and his absence was more alarming than his colleague's assault. "One unaccounted for," Brennan said, wiping blood from a cut on his forearm with the flat disinterest of a man who had stopped noticing minor wounds years ago. The missing man appeared 20 minutes later, not inside the house but on the approach road, riding east at full gallop, disappearing over the ridge before Brennan could organize a pursuit. He had never been part of the assault team. He had been an observer, positioned to watch the attack, assess the defensive response, catalog the number and quality of guards, and report everything back to whoever had sent them. The attack had been a reconnaissance mission disguised as an assassination attempt. They had not come to kill Seraphine. They had come to measure the defenses around her, which meant the real attack was still coming. Carriage arrived at Thornfield 4 hours later, riding hard through the early darkness with 6 additional guards pulled from Blackthorn's reserves, men he had selected personally from a roster that excluded anyone Hollis had recruited or trained. The precaution felt like cutting off his own hand to prevent infection, brutal but necessary. He found Seraphine in the main hall, sitting with the satchel on her lap and a cup of tea she had not touched cooling beside her. She was not shaking. She was not crying. She was sitting with the rigid composure of a person who had burned through fear and come out the other side into something clearer and colder. "They came to test the perimeter," she said before he could speak. 3 men. 2 engaged your guards as a distraction. The third observed and withdrew. They know how many men you have here, how they are positioned, and how quickly they respond. Carriage absorbed the tactical report with a nod that acknowledged both the information and the woman delivering it. She had been attacked in her own home by armed professionals, and her response was a battlefield assessment delivered with the precision of a trained officer. "Hollis," he said. It was not a question. It was a confirmation shared between 2 people who now operated inside the same strategic reality. "Your guard captain." 22 years. "I'm sorry." "Do not be. Sympathy is a waste of time in the middle of an operation. What I need is the decoded Ashford entries, all of them, tonight." Seraphine opened the satchel and produced a sheaf of papers covered in her careful handwriting. Decoded entries, cross-referenced with dates and corroborating evidence, organized with the methodical clarity of a woman who understood that information was only as powerful as its accessibility. Carriage read through the pages at the desk in Thornfield's study, a room that had transformed over the past weeks from a ruin into something that resembled a functional command center. The decoded entries painted a portrait of the Duke of Ashford as a man who had sold every appointment, every judgment, every military contract in his sphere of influence to the highest bidder for nearly 20 years, with Marcus Ashcombe serving as the financial architect who made the transactions untraceable. Until now. "This is enough to bring Ashford before the House of Lords," Carriage said, "but the Privy Council inquiry into my own conduct happens in 11 days. Marcus has framed the narrative to make me look like the conspirator and Ashford look like the victim. If I present this evidence after the inquiry has already established its conclusions, it will be dismissed as fabrication designed to divert attention from my own crimes. Then you present it before the inquiry. That requires access to the House of Lords, which requires allies willing to sponsor the presentation. Fairfax is one. I need at least 2 more who will stake their reputations on evidence decoded from a dead baron's hidden ledger by his daughter, a woman the Crown considers the heir of a convicted traitor. Then we give them something they cannot dismiss, something that proves the ledger is authentic beyond any political objection. Seraphine reached into the satchel again and produced a single sheet of paper. I decoded this last night, an entry from 17 years ago. A payment from the Ashford Network to a construction firm that handled renovations at 3 parliamentary members' private residences. The firm no longer exists, but the renovations do. If the payments documented in this ledger match the actual construction records still held in county archives, the correlation proves the ledger's accuracy through physical, verifiable evidence that no one could have fabricated. Kedrick looked at her. In the candlelight of the battered study, with dust in her hair and fatigue carved into the lines around her eyes, she looked nothing like the aristocratic women he had spent his life navigating around. She looked like a weapon, the kind of weapon that does not announce itself, that does not gleam or posture, but cuts with a precision that leaves the target wondering how they bled before they felt the blade. "You have been planning this for longer than you have admitted," he said. "I have been planning this since I was old enough to understand what was taken from my father." "How many more corroborations can you produce?" 7, each one tied to a physical record that still exists in public archives. Construction permits, land transfers, shipping manifests, everyone independently verifiable. Kedrick stood. The chair scraped against the stone floor with a sound that felt like a line being drawn. "Then we do not defend against the inquiry. We attack through it. I will appear before the Privy Council as summoned. I will bring the decoded evidence, the corroborations, and you." "Me?" "You are the decoder, the daughter of the man who compiled the evidence. The living proof that the Crown's investigation was not justice but suppression. Without you in the room, the evidence is documents. With you in the room, it is a story. And stories are what move the men who think they are above being moved. Your brother will be there. I am counting on it." The days that followed compressed into a single sustained act of preparation so intense that Seraphine would later remember them not as individual days but as one continuous stream of work, strategy, and the growing proximity of a confrontation that would leave no one unchanged. They worked side by side in Thornfield's study, decoding, cross-referencing, building the evidentiary architecture that would either save them or bury them. Kedrick dispatched riders to county archives across southern England, retrieving construction records, land transfer documents, and shipping manifests that confirmed entry after entry in the ledger with a precision that left no room for coincidence. By the 8th day, they had assembled a case so comprehensive that Kedrick allowed himself, for the first time, to believe it might work. On the 9th day, Hollis arrived at Thornfield. He came alone, unarmed, riding through the gate with his hands visible, and his face carrying an expression that Kedrick had never seen on him. Not guilt, not defiance. Something closer to exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of a man who had been carrying a weight for so long that its removal, even by force, felt like relief. Brennan's guards surrounded him immediately. Kedrick emerged from the manor and stood in the courtyard 10 feet from the man who had trained him, protected him, and betrayed him. "I am not here to fight," Hollis said. "I am here to tell you what is coming." "Why would I believe anything you say?" "Because they are going to kill her, Kedrick." Hollis used the Duke's first name for the first time in 22 years, and the sound of it cracked something in the air between them. "Not detain her, not seize the evidence. Kill her. Marcus has authorized a company of mercenaries, 40 men. They will hit Thornfield on the 11th night, the night before the inquiry, to ensure the evidence and the woman who can present it never reach London. And you are telling me this because your conscience finally woke up. I am telling you this because I have a son. He is 14. Marcus has had him in London for the past 2 years, enrolled in a school that Marcus selected and funded. I was told that if I stopped providing intelligence, the boy would disappear. Not harmed, just gone. Placed somewhere I would never find him." Kedrick stared at Hollis and felt the fury and the understanding crash into each other like tidal forces meeting over a reef. A man with a child held hostage was not a traitor by choice. He was a prisoner operating under coercion so absolute that resistance meant sacrificing the only thing that mattered more than duty. It did not excuse the betrayal. It did not undo the damage, but it transformed the shape of it from malice into something more human and therefore more painful. 40 men, Kedrick said, the 11th night. Professionals. Foreign mercenaries contracted through Ashford's network. They will approach from the Eastern Valley and the Northern Road simultaneously, a pincer designed to prevent retreat. And the inquiry? Marcus expects you to either die at Thornfield or flee and forfeit your defense. Either way, the evidence is destroyed and you are finished. Cadric turned to Seraphine, who had emerged from the manor and stood in the doorway, listening. Their eyes met across the courtyard, and in that exchange a decision was made without words. They were not going to run. They were not going to hide. They were going to stand at Thornfield with whatever force they could assemble and hold until the evidence survived long enough to reach London. The man who could not afford to lose anything had just committed to risking everything on a single night. "Hollis," Cadric said without looking away from Seraphine, "your son. Where is he in London?" "Marcus's townhouse, Kensington. 3rd floor, East Wing." Cadric turned back to his former guard captain. "Brennan, send our fastest rider to London tonight. Lord Fairfax's address. The message is one sentence. Retrieve a 14-year-old boy from Marcus Ashcombe's Kensington residence, 3rd floor, East Wing, and keep him safe until you hear from me directly. Fairfax will understand." Hollis's face broke. Not dramatically, not with tears, but with the slow fracturing of a man whose last defense, the one he had built around the impossible situation he had been living inside, finally gave way. His jaw trembled once, and he locked it down. "I will fight for you tonight," Hollis said. "I know. Not because of the boy, because of what I owe. I do not care about your reasons. I care about your sword arm. You are still the best fighter I have ever trained with, and in approximately 40 hours, I am going to need every blade I can trust." The 11th night arrived with a stillness that felt like the world holding its breath. Thornfield Manor stood in the darkness like a lantern in a field, its windows lit, its courtyard active, its defenses visible. Cadric had positioned 23 fighters across the estate, every man he could assemble from loyal reserves without drawing attention from the compromised elements of his household. 23 against 40. The mathematics were terrible, but mathematics did not account for terrain advantage, defensive preparation, or the particular ferocity of men fighting not for wages, but for something they believed was worth dying for. The mercenaries appeared at the edge of the Eastern Valley at 11, moving in 2 columns exactly as Hollis had predicted. Professional, disciplined, equipped for a swift, overwhelming assault against a lightly defended manor. They were not expecting fortified positions. They were not expecting crossfire from the stone walls Seraphine had reinforced during the repairs. And they were not expecting the Duke of Blackthorn to be standing in the courtyard, armed and waiting, with the expression of a man who had already calculated the cost of this night and decided to pay it. The first wave hit the eastern wall and broke against Brennan's prepared defenses. Steel met steel in the darkness. The sound carried across the valley in sharp, ugly bursts that bore no resemblance to the choreographed elegance of tournament combat. This was close-quarters butchery, men grappling in mud and moonlight, and every second of it was paid for in blood. Cadric fought from the courtyard, meeting mercenaries who breached the main gate with a controlled violence that Hollis had helped him build over 22 years of morning drills. His blade found targets with the mechanical precision of a man operating beyond anger, beyond fear, in the stripped-down clarity that only comes when survival has consumed every other function. His left shoulder took a cut in the first 3 minutes, deep enough to bleed freely, and he registered the pain the way he registered weather, acknowledged, cataloged, and set aside because a man who stops for pain stops for everything. Hollis fought beside him. The guard captain moved with the desperate efficiency of a man trying to balance a ledger that could never be fully balanced. Every mercenary he dropped a payment against a debt that 22 years of betrayal had built. He was magnificent and tragic in equal measure. And Cadric fought next to him without forgiveness, but with the pragmatic recognition that tonight, at least, their survival interests were identical. Inside the manor, Seraphine secured the satchel containing the evidence and the decoded documents. She had positioned herself in the study with a barricade and the single-minded understanding that if the evidence was destroyed, nothing that happened in the courtyard mattered. 3 mercenaries breached the east corridor. 2 were stopped by guards positioned inside. The 3rd reached the study door. Seraphine heard the impact against the barricade and felt the wood shudder. She looked at the satchel in her hands, the culmination of her father's life work, and her own years of grief and determination, and felt a calm settle over her that was not courage in the way stories describe courage. It was simpler than that. It was the knowledge that she had already lost everything once, and that the worst thing fear could do to her had already been done. The barricade held. Brennan reached the corridor and neutralized the third attacker with a brutality that left the man motionless on the stone floor. In the courtyard, the battle turned. The mercenaries, designed for a quick strike, were not built for sustained engagement against fortified defenders. Their second wave faltered against the crossfire from the walls, and their discipline began to fragment as casualties mounted beyond the threshold their contract had anticipated. By midnight, 12 mercenaries were down. The rest were pulling back toward the valley, their formation dissolving into the disorganized retreat of men who had calculated that their pay was no longer worth their lives. Cadric stood in the courtyard, breathing hard, his left arm soaked with blood from the shoulder wound, his blade wet and his eyes carrying the expression of a man who had just survived something that would have killed him 6 months ago, not because he was weaker then, but because 6 months ago he would have fought alone. He looked toward the manor entrance. Seraphine stood in the doorway, the satchel clutched against her chest, her face white but her eyes steady. The evidence had survived, and tomorrow they would take it to London. But from the darkness beyond the eastern ridge, a sound carried across the valley that froze every person in the courtyard. Hoofbeats. Not the retreating mercenaries. New riders, dozens of them, coming fast from the direction of the northern road. Brennan reached Cadric's side in 3 strides. Reinforcements. Theirs or ours? Cadric stared into the darkness. His men were spent. His ammunition was depleted. His body was bleeding from 3 separate wounds. If those riders were a second wave, Thornfield would not survive the next hour. The first banner crested the ridge, visible in the moonlight for exactly 1 second before the riders descended toward the manor, and Cadric could not tell whose colors it carried. The banner was Fairfax's. Cadric recognized the silver and black before the riders reached the gate, and the recognition traveled through his body like a current reversing direction, every muscle that had been bracing for a final stand now recalibrating to absorb the fact that he was not going to die in this courtyard tonight. The sensation was not relief. Relief implied surprise, and Cadric had stopped being surprised by survival years ago. What he felt was closer to a recalculation of debt. He had been prepared to spend everything. Now he would have to live with whatever was left, and living costs more than dying in ways that most men never learned, because most men were never forced to stand at the exact boundary between the two and then be pulled back. Fairfax himself rode at the head of the column. 30 armed men in organized formation, dispatched from London at a pace that had killed 2 horses along the route. The old lord dismounted in Thornfield's courtyard and surveyed the aftermath of the battle with the grim efficiency of a man who had seen combat in his youth and never fully left it behind. "You look terrible," Fairfax said. "You are 12 hours early. Your message about the boy arrived. I sent men to Kensington within the hour. The boy is safe. He is at my London residence under guard." Fairfax paused and looked at the bodies being dragged from the courtyard by Brennan's men. "When I realized Marcus had a hostage operation running, I understood the timeline had accelerated beyond what either of us predicted, so I brought what I could gather and rode through the night." "How did you know they would hit Thornfield tonight?" "I did not. I assumed the worst and prepared accordingly. It is a habit I developed from watching you operate for the past 15 years. Cadric almost smiled. The expression did not quite reach his face, stopped by the pain radiating from his shoulder wound and the deeper pain of everything that had happened in the past 11 days. But it existed somewhere behind his eyes where only someone who knew him well would recognize it. "The boy," Hollis said from behind them. The guard captain had not moved since Fairfax's column arrived. He stood in the courtyard with blood on his hands and an expression that belonged to a man who had been holding his breath for 2 years and had only just been told he could exhale. "You said he is safe." Fairfax turned to Hollis and studied him for several seconds. The old lord knew. The intelligence network that connected the senior members of the aristocracy operated on implication and inference, and Fairfax had clearly assembled the picture from Cadric's message. Guard captain. Compromised. A child used as leverage. "The boy is safe, unharmed, and asking for his father," Fairfax said. His voice carried no judgment. Judgment was a luxury for men who had never been forced into impossible choices, and Fairfax was old enough to know that the number of such men was significantly smaller than the world pretended. Hollis closed his eyes. The movement lasted 2 seconds. When he opened them, something had changed in the architecture of his face. A tension that had been load-bearing for 2 years suddenly released, leaving the structure altered but standing. Cadric watched his former guard captain and felt the complicated machinery of his own judgment grinding through calculations that had no clean solution. Hollis had betrayed him. Hollis had also been coerced through the most effective leverage available, a child's safety. Hollis had come to Thornfield to warn him, and had fought beside him when the mercenaries attacked. The ledger of loyalty and betrayal did not balance to zero. It balanced to something messier, more human, and therefore more difficult to process than simple condemnation. He filed it. Not resolved, not forgiven, but filed in the place where complicated truths lived until he had the bandwidth to address them properly. Tonight was not the night. Tomorrow was London. They left Thornfield at first light, a column of 53 men escorting Cadric, Seraphine, and the satchel containing evidence that would either reshape the English aristocracy or destroy them both. The ride to London took 2 days at a pace that balanced urgency against the practical reality that arriving exhausted would serve no one. Seraphine rode beside Cadric for most of the journey. They did not speak much. The silence between them had evolved over the past weeks, from the adversarial tension of their first meeting into something that required no narration, the shared quiet of two people who had been through enough together that words had become optional for the essential communications. She noticed when his shoulder wound stiffened and he shifted his grip on the reins. He noticed when fatigue thinned her focus and her eyes lost the sharp tracking quality that was her default state. They adjusted for each other without discussion, the way soldiers on a long march learn to compensate for their partner's weaknesses without being asked. On the second night, camped at a coaching inn 12 miles north of London, Cadric sat by the fire in the private room Fairfax had secured and reviewed the evidentiary package one final time. Every decoded entry, every corroborating document retrieved from county archives, every cross-reference that connected the ledger's records to physical, verifiable facts that no political maneuvering could dismiss. Seraphine entered the room and sat across from him. The firelight carved sharp shadows across her face, and for the first time since he had met her, she looked not just tired, but uncertain. Not about the evidence, about what came after. "When this is finished," she said, "Blackthorn will be different. Blackthorn will be what I make it. That is what concerns me." She met his eyes. "You have spent your entire life building power through control, absolute authority, unquestioned command, and you have been effective because the system around you rewarded those qualities. But the system you are about to expose is the same system that created the conditions for your authority. When you dismantle the corruption, you dismantle the fear that kept your enemies in check. What replaces it?" The question sat between them like a stone placed on a scale. Cadric felt its weight not as an intellectual challenge, but as something more personal, a confrontation with the version of himself that had walked into Thornfield 3 weeks ago, believing that control was the only mechanism that mattered. That man had been effective. That man had been feared. That man had also been completely alone, operating inside a fortress that he believed was impregnable, while his own guard captain reported his movements to his brother. And the isolation he had mistaken for strength had been, in fact, the exact vulnerability his enemies exploited. "I do not know," he said. The words cost him something visible. His jaw tightened, released, tightened again. The physical signature of a man forcing himself to speak a truth that contradicted everything he had built his identity around. "I have never operated without control as the primary mechanism. I do not know what replaces it." "Trust," Seraphine said. "Not blind trust. Not the naive kind that gets exploited, the kind that is built through shared risk and tested under pressure, the kind we built at Thornfield. Trust failed me. Hollis trusted me, and I trusted him, and the entire structure collapsed. Hollis was coerced. His trust in you was real. His betrayal was not a failure of trust. It was a failure of the system that gave Marcus the power to weaponize a child against his father. The mechanism broke, not the principle." Cadric looked at her for a long time. The fire cracked and shifted, sending sparks upward into the darkness of the chimney. He had spent 34 years perfecting the art of control, refining it into the core operating principle of everything he did, every relationship he managed, every territory he governed. And the woman sitting across from him, the daughter of a destroyed baron, the heir of a ruined estate, a person who possessed none of the institutional power he had spent his life accumulating, was telling him that the principle itself was insufficient. Not wrong. Insufficient, a foundation that could support a fortress but not a future. He did not answer, but he did not dismiss it. And for Carriage Ashcombe, the absence of dismissal was its own form of revolution. London received them with the particular indifference of a city that has absorbed centuries of political upheaval and learned to keep functioning regardless of which faction currently occupied the upper floors. Cedric's party entered through the northern gate and proceeded directly to the parliamentary chambers where the Privy Council inquiry was scheduled to convene. The chamber was full. Lords, ministers, advisors, and observers packed the gallery in the way that London's political class gathered whenever the potential for spectacle exceeded the potential for boredom. The air smelled of wood polish, candle wax, and the particular tension of men who suspected they were about to witness something that would rearrange their world. Marcus Ashcombe was seated at the petitioner's table. Cedric had not seen his brother in over a year, and the change was subtle but legible. Marcus was thinner, sharper in the face, with the particular energy of a man who had been operating at maximum intensity for months, and was running on the fumes of adrenaline and conviction. His eyes found Cedric the moment the Duke entered the chamber, and what passed between them was not the hatred of enemies, but the far more complicated recognition of two men who had once shared a childhood and now shared nothing except a last name and a mutual understanding that one of them would not leave this room with his life intact. The Lord Chancellor called the proceedings to order. Marcus's petition was read aloud. Charges of treasonous conspiracy, harboring a fugitive on crown property, deployment of private military forces in defiance of parliamentary authority. Each accusation was delivered in the measured cadence of legal language, and each one landed in the chamber with the weight of a stone dropped into still water. Cedric listened without visible reaction. He had learned decades ago that the most powerful response to an accusation was silence, maintained long enough to make the accuser wonder whether the accused had already planned for everything they were about to say. When the reading concluded, the Chancellor turned to Cedric. "Your Grace, you may respond." Cedric stood. The chamber shifted, every body adjusting fractionally as the Duke of Blackthorn rose to his full height with the controlled precision of a man who understood that physical presence was itself a form of argument. "I will respond," he said, "but not to the charges as presented. The charges are a fabrication designed to prevent what I'm about to do, which is present evidence of a conspiracy so extensive that it implicates individuals currently seated in this chamber." The noise that followed was not quite an uproar, but the sharp collective intake of breath that precedes one. "I call Lady Seraphine Vale to present testimony." Marcus was on his feet before the Chancellor could respond. "The petitioner objects. Lady Vale is the daughter of a convicted traitor and has no standing before this body." "Baron Aldrich Vale was never convicted," Cedric said, his voice cutting through the chamber with the flat authority of a man stating a fact he had verified down to the letter. "He was accused, investigated, and stripped of his property and title without trial. He died without a single charge being adjudicated in a court of law. His daughter is a free subject of the Crown with every right to present testimony in any proceeding that concerns her family's interests." The Chancellor, a careful man who had survived 3 changes of political regime by never committing to a position until he was certain which direction the wind was blowing, considered for several seconds. "Lady Vale may present testimony. The chamber will determine its relevance." Seraphine rose from her seat beside Fairfax and walked to the center of the chamber. She carried the satchel openly, making no attempt to conceal it, and set it on the table in front of her with the deliberate care of someone placing a loaded weapon in plain view. She did not look at Marcus. She looked at the chamber. "My father, Baron Aldrich Vale, spent 7 years documenting a network of corruption that penetrated the highest levels of the English aristocracy. Payments to judges, bribes for military contracts, purchased parliamentary appointments. Every transaction recorded in cipher inside household account ledgers that were dismissed as mundane bookkeeping by the investigators who seized Thornfield. She opened the satchel and produced the decoded entries, one page at a time, reading each one with the clarity and precision of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her mind since she was old enough to understand what had been taken from her father. Names, dates, amounts, destinations. The mechanical infrastructure of corruption laid bare in language that left no room for ambiguity or denial. The chamber listened. The silence was the kind that has weight, physical and oppressive, pressing down on every person in the room with the understanding that what they were hearing could not be unheard and its implications could not be contained. Marcus attempted to interrupt 3 times. Each time the chancellor overruled him with increasing firmness, because the evidence Seraphine was presenting had crossed the threshold from allegation into documentation, and the legal machinery of the chamber, however corrupted, still possessed enough structural integrity to recognize the difference. When she reached the entries documenting Marcus Ashcombe's role as financial intermediary, the chamber noise rose to a level that required the chancellor's gavel. Marcus stood at his table with an expression that had evolved from confident aggression through disbelief into something Carriage recognized from years of studying his brother's face. Cornered fury. The look of a man whose exit strategies were closing simultaneously. "These are forgeries," Marcus said, "fabricated by a woman with every motive to manufacture evidence against the men who investigated her father." Seraphine did not raise her voice. She reached into the satchel and produced the corroborating documents. Construction records from county archives matching payments in the ledger. Land transfer certificates bearing dates and amounts identical to the decoded entries. Shipping manifests from port authorities confirming transactions that the ledger recorded 17 years before Seraphine had ever set foot in Thornfield. Every entry in this ledger corresponds to a physical record held in public archives across 6 counties, she said. Records that I could not have fabricated because they were filed years before I decoded the first line of my father's cipher. The Lord Chancellor is welcome to verify every document independently. I have provided the archive locations and reference numbers for each one. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. It was the silence of a room full of powerful men realizing that the ground beneath their feet had shifted and that some of them were standing on the side that was about to collapse. The Duke of Ashford, seated in the gallery, stood and left the chamber without speaking. His departure was noted by everyone and commented on by no one, because the act of leaving said more than any statement could have. Marcus looked at Carriage. Across the chamber, across 15 feet of polished floor, and the accumulated wreckage of their shared history, the brothers faced each other with the complete understanding of 2 men who had arrived at the end of something that could not be rebuilt. "You would destroy your own family," Marcus said. "You destroyed our family 3 years ago. I am simply documenting the damage." Father would have handled this differently. Father would never have needed to. Because Father would never have sold his name to men who paid for the arrest of an innocent man and used a child as a hostage to turn his own guard captain into a spy. The chamber heard the accusation. Marcus's face went through a series of transformations that Carriage watched, with the detached precision of a surgeon observing a procedure he had initiated but could no longer control. Shock, calculation, the brief flicker of denial, and then, finally, the flat emptiness of a man who has run out of moves and knows it. Marcus sat down. He did not speak again for the remainder of the proceedings. The inquiry lasted 4 more hours. By its conclusion, the Lord Chancellor had authorized a full judicial investigation into every individual named in the ledger. The Duke of Ashford's properties were placed under Crown seizure. 3 members of Parliament were suspended pending investigation. And the charges against Carriage Ashcombe were dismissed with a formal acknowledgement that his actions at Thornfield constituted lawful defense of evidence material to Crown interests. Baron Aldrich Vale's name was ordered cleared from the record of accusations, pending formal review, a process that would take months, but whose outcome was no longer in doubt. Marcus Ashcombe was taken into custody as he exited the chamber. He did not resist. He walked between the marshals with his shoulders straight and his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the walls of the building, beyond London, beyond anything that existed in the present. Carriage watched his brother disappear through the side door and felt the weight of it settle into his chest like sediment sinking to the bottom of a deep river. Not satisfaction, not vindication, Just the heavy, permanent awareness that the person he had wrestled with as a boy, had competed with as a young man, had loved in the complicated way that brothers love each other when love and rivalry occupy the same space, was gone. Not dead. Removed. Excised from the structure of Caedric's life with the surgical finality of a procedure that saves the body by sacrificing the limb. He would carry that weight for the rest of his life. He knew this with the same certainty he knew the dimensions of his own study and the count of steps across the West Gallery. Some costs do not diminish over time. They simply become part of the architecture. The weeks that followed moved at a different pace. The frenetic urgency of the conspiracy's unraveling gave way to the slower, more methodical rhythm of institutional correction. Judicial proceedings ground forward, properties were seized and redistributed, titles were revoked. The network that had operated in shadow for nearly 2 decades was dismantled not in a single dramatic stroke, but in the tedious, necessary work of legal process that turned evidence into verdicts and verdicts into consequences. Caedric returned to Blackthorn and began the work of rebuilding what the crisis had damaged. Not the physical fortress, which had never been breached, but the invisible architecture of trust and authority that made the fortress function. He restructured his personal guard, promoting Brennan to captain and implementing protocols that prevented any single individual from holding enough information to compromise the entire operation. Hollis he dealt with privately, in the study where so many of the critical decisions had been made. The former guard captain stood before him with the bearing of a man who expected judgment and was prepared to accept whatever form it took. "Your son is back in your custody," Caedric said. Fairfax saw to his return personally. "I know, I owe Fairfax a debt I cannot repay." "You owe me one as well." "I know that too." Caedric studied the man who had trained him, betrayed him, and then bled beside him at Thornfield. The calculation he performed was not strategic, it was personal, and personal calculations were harder because they did not yield clean answers. "I cannot restore your position," Caedric said. "The breach of trust is too severe, and the precedent of reinstating a compromised officer would undermine every security measure I have implemented." "I understand. But I can offer you a position managing the coastal watch stations, independent command, away from the castle. Close enough to serve, far enough to rebuild without the weight of what happened here pressing on you every morning." Hollis was quiet for a long time. "That is more than I deserve." "Probably. But I'm learning that decisions based purely on what people deserve produce a world that is efficient and empty. I would rather build something that accounts for the fact that people break under pressure and sometimes find their way back." It was the closest Caedric had ever come to articulating a philosophy that contradicted the operating principles he had lived by for 34 years. The words felt unfamiliar in his mouth, like speaking a language he was still learning. But they were true in the way that hard-won truths are true, not because they sound elegant, but because they cost something to arrive at. Hollis accepted the position. He left Blackthorn the following morning with his son, riding south toward the coast without looking back. Caedric watched them go from the study window and felt something shift in the internal landscape that he had spent so many years fortifying against exactly this kind of vulnerability. Thornfield's restoration took 3 months. Seraphine oversaw the work personally, transforming the estate from a ruin maintained in deliberate neglect into a functioning manor that bore the marks of its history without being defined by them. She kept the water stains on the study ceiling. She kept the chipped ceramic jug where she had placed wildflowers on her first day. The scars of the mercenary attack, sword marks in the corridor walls, a shattered doorframe in the east wing, she repaired but did not conceal. The estate's past was part of its structure, and erasing it would have been a different kind of dishonesty. Caedric visited on a Tuesday in late autumn, riding the familiar route from Blackthorn through the southern border country. The landscape had changed with the season, the greens replaced by amber and rust, the air carrying the sharp clarity that comes when summer's humidity burns off and leaves everything exposed. Seraphine met him at the entrance, not because she had been watching for him, but because she had been working in the garden she was establishing along the eastern wall and heard his horse on the approach road. She was wearing a practical dress with soil on the hem and her hair pulled back in the functional style he had come to associate with her. She looked exactly like herself, which was something Caedric had learned to value more than beauty or grace or any of the qualities that aristocratic culture trained men to evaluate women by. She looked like a person who had decided who she was and was not interested in performing a more palatable version for anyone's comfort. "The East Wing is finished," she said. "I can see that. The county archives confirmed the last 3 corroborations yesterday. The Judicial Commission has everything it needs to complete the investigation without further testimony from either of us." "I heard." "Then why are you here?" The question was delivered with the directness that had characterized every exchange between them since their first meeting in this same entryway. No preliminary courtesies, no social lubrication, just the clean, bare inquiry of a woman who valued clarity above all forms of comfort. Caedric dismounted. He stood in front of her with his hands at his sides and his expression stripped of the controlled neutrality that he wore like armor in every other interaction. What remained was something she had seen only in fragments before. In the scullery, when she showed him his brother's name. In the courtyard at Thornfield, when Fairfax's banner crested the ridge. In the chamber, when Marcus was led away. The face beneath the face. The one that cost him to show. "I am here because Blackthorn is 15 miles from Thornfield, and for 34 years I have treated that distance as a strategic buffer. I have treated every distance as a strategic buffer, between myself and my enemies, between myself and my allies, between myself and anyone who might see the parts of me that are not useful for governance or combat or the maintenance of authority." He paused. The wind moved through the garden beside them, stirring the plant Seraphine had been tending, and the sound was gentle in a way that felt foreign against the severity of what he was saying. "You asked me what replaces control. I have been thinking about that question for weeks, and I still do not have a complete answer. But I have a partial one, and the partial answer is that control is what you build when you are afraid of what happens when you stop building. It is architecture designed to prevent collapse, and it works until it does not. And when it fails, the man inside the architecture has nothing left because he invested everything in the walls and nothing in the ground beneath them." Seraphine watched him with an expression he could not fully read, which was itself remarkable. He could read nearly everyone. She remained the exception, not because she was opaque, but because what she showed on her face was always exactly what she meant, and Caedric had spent so long interpreting performances that genuine transparency disoriented him. "You're telling me you want to build something different," she said. "I'm telling you that I already have. At Thornfield, in a scullery, over a decoded ledger, with a woman who refused to hand me the only power she had because she understood something about leverage and trust that I had not learned yet. And what did I understand? That giving someone everything they ask for is not trust. It is surrender. And that the only partnerships worth building are the ones where both people hold enough power to walk away and choose not to." Seraphine looked at him for a long time. The autumn light caught the sharp planes of his face and softened them in a way that had nothing to do with the light and everything to do with what he had just said. For the first time since they met, the Duke of Blackthorn was not negotiating, not strategizing, not positioning for advantage. He was standing in front of her with his defenses down, offering not a transaction but a truth, and the cost of that truth was written in every line of his body. "Thornfield stays mine," she said. "I would not have it any other way. And my father's name is cleared, fully, publicly, not as a footnote in a judicial report, but as a formal statement before the House of Lords. Fairfax is already drafting the motion. It will be read before the end of the parliamentary session. And you will stop treating every person in your life as either a resource or a threat. That will take longer. I know. I am not asking for it to happen overnight. I am asking for it to happen." He extended his hand, the same gesture he had used in the scullery when they sealed their alliance, direct, unperformed, carrying the weight of a commitment made between two people who had earned the right to demand honesty from each other. She took it. Her grip was the same as before, firm, dry, lasting exactly as long as it needed to. But this time, neither of them let go. They stood in the entrance of Thornfield Manor as the autumn wind moved through the valley below, and the late afternoon light turned the stone walls the color of old gold. Behind them, the estate that had been deliberately ruined stood restored, bearing its scars without apology. To the north, Blackthorn's towers rose above the ridgeline, no longer a fortress isolated by design, but the anchor of something larger, something that included the 15 miles of contested border country and the woman who had refused to surrender it. In the months that followed, the duchy transformed, not through dramatic reform or public proclamation, but through the accumulation of decisions that reflected a different operating principle. Carriage remained formidable. His authority did not diminish. His enemies did not suddenly find him approachable or warm. But the nature of his power shifted from something that was wielded to something that was shared, and the distinction, invisible to most observers, changed everything about how Blackthorn functioned. Seraphine became Duchess of Blackthorn on a morning in early spring, in a ceremony attended by Fairfax, Brennan, the laborers who had helped her clear debris from a ruined manor, and exactly no one who had not earned their place through something more durable than social obligation. She wore a dress that was simple, well-made, and entirely free of the ornamental excess that ducal weddings traditionally demanded. When asked by a London correspondent why the ceremony was so modest, Carrige's response was characteristic. "We are not performing. We are making a decision. Decisions do not require an audience." They governed Blackthorn together, and the partnership that emerged was unlike anything the English aristocracy had seen, not because it was equal, though it was, but because it was functional. Carriage provided the strategic architecture, the military precision, the institutional authority that kept the duchy secure. Seraphine provided the intelligence, the accountability, and the insistence on transparency that prevented the architecture from becoming a cage. They argued frequently, agreed selectively, and maintained the particular respect that exists between two people who know exactly how dangerous the other can be and value that danger rather than fearing it. On an evening in late summer, nearly a year after the Privy Council hearing that had dismantled the conspiracy and reshaped the aristocratic landscape, Carriage stood at the battlements of Blackthorn Castle and looked out across the territories that stretched from the coastal cliffs to the southern border where Thornfield's chimneys were just visible against the tree line. The sun was setting behind him, casting long shadows eastward across land that he had fought for, nearly lost, and ultimately held through means he could never have imagined when he stood at this same spot a year ago, certain that control was the only currency that mattered. Seraphine joined him without announcement. She stood beside him with her shoulder close enough to touch his arm and looked at the same landscape with the quiet attention of someone seeing not just territory but history, not just a duchy but the accumulated evidence of what two people could build when they stopped trying to possess each other and started trying to protect what they had made together. "Your brother's trial concluded today," she said. "Fairfax sent word. Guilty on all charges, stripped of titles and confined indefinitely." Carriage absorbed the information in silence. He had known the verdict was coming. The evidence was overwhelming, and Marcus's defense had collapsed weeks ago when 3 of his co-conspirators provided testimony in exchange for reduced sentences. The outcome was justice by any reasonable measure. But justice delivered against your own brother does not feel like victory. It feels like surgery performed without anesthesia, necessary and brutal, and leaving scars that ache in weather you cannot predict. "Are you all right?" Seraphine asked. "I will be." "That is not the same as yes." "No, it is not." He looked at her. The evening light caught the angles of her face in a way that reminded him of the first time he saw her in the ruined study at Thornfield, standing on a chair, reaching for a ledger, turning to face him with the speed of someone who had been listening for danger since she arrived. She had been ready then. She was ready now. She would always be ready, not because the world demanded it, but because readiness was who she was. "I spent my entire life building walls," he said, "against enemies, against vulnerability, against the possibility that someone might get close enough to see the parts that do not function well. And the thing I learned this year is that walls do not protect you from the threats that matter. The threats that matter are already inside. They live in the assumptions you make about your own strength and the people you refuse to see clearly, because seeing them clearly would mean admitting that you are not as in control as you need to believe." He turned back to the landscape. The shadows were lengthening, stretching across the fields below, like fingers reaching for something they would never quite touch. "My brother was inside the walls for years. Hollis was inside the walls. The corruption my father's generation built was inside the walls of the entire aristocracy. And I missed all of it because I was so focused on fortifying the perimeter that I never looked at what was already standing next to me. And now I look. It is harder. It is slower. It costs more than I expected, but the things I see when I actually look are worth more than everything I built when I was blind." Seraphine placed her hand on the stone battlement next to his, not touching, but close enough that the space between them was a choice rather than a distance. "Your father would be proud of you," Cadric said. "Not because the conspiracy was exposed or because his name was cleared, because his daughter turned out to be exactly the kind of person he trusted her to be. And yours? My father would be confused. He understood power as dominance. I am learning to understand it as something else. The vocabulary for it does not come naturally to a man who was raised on the other definition. You will find the words. Or you will find them for me. That is also possible." They stood together at the battlements of Blackthorn Castle as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared above the North Sea. The fortress around them was the same one that had stood for 4 centuries, built by men who believed that stone and iron were the only materials that endured. But the 2 people standing on its walls had learned something those builders never understood. Stone keeps out the weather. Iron holds the gate. But what makes a fortress last, what makes anything last, is the decision to stop building walls against the people who deserve to stand beside you and start building something that neither of you could construct alone. Every enemy had fallen. Every debt had been settled. Every secret had been brought into the light and dealt with on its merits. The Duchy of Blackthorn belonged to them both, not through conquest or inheritance or the accumulation of control, but through the simple, irreversible act of choosing each other when every safer option was still on the table. And that choice, made in a ruined scullery over a dead man's ledger, witnessed by no one and sealed with nothing more than a handshake between 2 people who had every reason to remain enemies, would endure longer than any wall ever built.